It was a quiet evening in the small town of Maplewood, where life moved at its own unhurried pace. The streets were lined with modest houses, and the air carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass. In one corner of the town, Marcus Johnson, a soft-spoken mechanic in his early 30s, was wrapping up work for the day. His hands were calloused from years of fixing cars, but there was something about him that set him apart from others who worked in the same garage. While most people thought he lived an ordinary life, fixing engines, listening to old jazz records, and keeping to himself, few knew the truth. Marcus spent every spare moment studying law. Marcus had always been curious about how things worked, especially when it came to fairness or the lack of it. Growing up, he'd seen too many injustices go unchallenged. Friends arrested without cause, families torn apart by wrongful convictions, and neighbors treated differently because of the color of their skin. It wasn't anger that drove Marcus. It was determination. He wanted to understand the system, not just to protect himself, but also to help others like him. So, while everyone else relaxed after work, Marcus read thick books on constitutional rights, landmark court cases, and legal strategies. He often stayed up late into the night, scribbling notes under the dim light of a desk lamp. On this particular evening, as Marcus locked up the garage and climbed into his beat-up sedan, he felt a sense of calm. The roads were empty, and the stars shimmered brightly above. But that peace didn't last long. As he approached the outskirts of town, blue and red lights flashed behind him. Startled, Marcus pulled over, wondering what he could have done wrong. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any stop signs, and certainly hadn't broken any rules. Still, he turned off the engine and waited patiently. Out of the cruiser stepped Officer Daniel Hayes, a man known throughout Maplewood for his gruff demeanor and questionable behavior. Hayes had a reputation for targeting black residents, often finding reasons to pull them over or search their vehicles. Some called him old school, though not in a complimentary way. To Marcus, Hayes represented everything he despised about the system, a symbol of unchecked authority and prejudice. "License and registration," Hayes barked, shining a flashlight directly into Marcus's face. The beam blinded him momentarily, but Marcus kept his composure. He handed over the requested documents, watching carefully as Hayes examined them under the glow of his flashlight. "You're coming from the garage?" Hayes asked, his tone accusatory rather than curious. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied politely. "I work there." Hayes nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "And you weren't speeding? Swerving? Nothing suspicious?" "No, sir," Marcus said firmly. "I was driving home." Hayes seemed unsatisfied with the answer. He circled the car once, then twice, peering inside as if searching for some invisible clue. Finally, he returned to Marcus's window. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Confused but compliant, Marcus did as he was told. Before he could ask why, Hayes began barking commands again. "Hands on the hood! Spread your legs!" Marcus obeyed, feeling the cold metal of the car against his palms. Then, without warning, Hayes shoved him hard, causing Marcus to stumble forward slightly. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "Resisting arrest," Hayes snapped, twisting Marcus's arms behind his back and slapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "You think you're smarter than me, huh? Think you can play games?" Marcus didn't resist. He knew better than to argue with someone like Hayes. Instead, he remained silent, letting the officer rant and rave as he shoved him into the back seat of the patrol car. By the time they reached the station, word had already spread through the sleepy town. Neighbors whispered about the incident, some believing Hayes's version of events, others skeptical but unwilling to speak out. Inside the station, Marcus sat quietly in a holding cell, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was bigger than that. This was about proving that even someone like him, a black man in a biased system, could stand up and fight. And as he began jotting down notes on scraps of paper, preparing for the battle ahead, Marcus smiled faintly. Hayes had no idea what he was dealing with. The next morning, news of Marcus's arrest traveled faster than anyone expected. Word spread through Maplewood like wildfire, fueled by gossip and speculation. At the local diner, patrons huddled around tables, sipping coffee and debating whether Marcus was guilty or innocent. Most sided with Officer Hayes, trusting his authority simply because he wore a badge. After all, Hayes had built a reputation as a tough enforcer, someone who kept the streets safe. Few dared to question his motives, let alone challenge his version of events. But Hayes wasn't celebrating quite yet. Back at the police station, he filled out paperwork, detailing the fabricated story he intended to present in court. According to his report, Marcus had resisted arrest, becoming aggressive and violent during the traffic stop. Hayes described the supposed struggle in vivid detail, painting himself as the hero who managed to subdue a dangerous suspect. He smirked as he wrote, confident that his word would hold more weight than Marcus's. After all, who would believe a black mechanic over a decorated officer? Meanwhile, Marcus remained in his cell, his thoughts focused and clear. Though the situation seemed dire, he refused to let fear take hold. Instead, he used the time wisely, drafting motions and affidavits using whatever materials he could find. A kind janitor slipped him a pen and some scrap paper, unaware of the brilliance hidden within Marcus's mind. Each note he wrote contained references to obscure statutes and procedural loopholes, details that would soon become his greatest weapon. When the arresting officers brought him food, they noticed the stack of papers growing beside him. One of them chuckled, nudging his partner. "What's he doing? Writing a book?" Marcus looked up calmly. "Something like that," he replied, his tone measured and composed. "Knowledge is power." The comment baffled the officers, who shrugged and walked away. They assumed Marcus was wasting his time scribbling nonsense to pass the hours. Little did they know each page contained a meticulously crafted strategy designed to expose the flaws in Hayes's case. By mid-afternoon, Marcus was finally allowed to make a phone call. He dialed his sister, Angela, explaining the situation, briefly before asking her to bring him specific items: a suit, a tie, and anything she could find related to recent cases involving police misconduct. Angela listened intently, her heart breaking for her brother, but also swelling with pride. She'd always admired Marcus's intellect and determination, and now she saw those qualities shine brighter than ever. The following day, Marcus appeared in front of Judge Thompson for his arraignment. Dressed in the suit Angela had delivered, Marcus stood tall, radiating confidence despite the circumstances. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Laura Klein, watched him closely, sizing him up. Like everyone else, she underestimated him, assuming he'd rely on a public defender or plead guilty to avoid further trouble. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Thompson began, "how do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice steady and strong. "And I'll be representing myself pro se." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Self-representation was rare, especially in cases like this. Klein exchanged a glance with Hayes, both visibly surprised by Marcus's decision. Surely, they thought, he wouldn't last long against an experienced prosecutor. As the hearing progressed, Hayes took the stand to recount his version of events. He spoke confidently, describing the alleged resistance and assault with theatrical flair. But as he testified, Marcus listened intently, taking notes and occasionally raising objections based on technicalities. For instance, when Hayes mentioned the missing dashcam footage, Marcus pointed out that its absence violated department protocol. Each objection caught Klein and the judge off guard, forcing them to pause and reconsider. When it came time for cross-examination, Marcus seized the opportunity. With calculated precision, he dismantled Hayes's testimony piece by piece. He highlighted inconsistencies in the timeline, questioned the lack of physical evidence, and cited precedents that undermined Hayes's credibility. By the end of the session, Hayes's bravado had faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. Outside the courtroom, Hayes muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "Who does this guy think he is?" he grumbled to a fellow officer. He got lucky with those fancy words. Little did Hayes realize, Marcus wasn't relying on luck. He was fighting back with the one thing Hayes couldn't comprehend: knowledge. And as the trial loomed ahead, Marcus knew he was just getting started. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Marcus Johnson stood up to present his case. Everyone expected him to stumble, to falter under the weight of representing himself against a seasoned prosecutor and a decorated police officer. But Marcus didn't flinch. Dressed in his neatly pressed suit, he carried himself with quiet confidence, his binder of handwritten notes tucked firmly under one arm. The murmurs in the room grew louder as people realized this wasn't just some random mechanic. They were witnessing something extraordinary. Assistant District Attorney Laura Klein cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the narrative. She began by calling Officer Daniel Hayes back to the stand for further questioning. Hayes, still smarting from Marcus's earlier cross-examination, clenched his jaw but nodded obediently. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the witness rail, ready to defend his story. Klein started gently, asking Hayes to recount the events leading up to Marcus's arrest. Hayes launched into his rehearsed testimony, describing how Marcus had supposedly resisted arrest during the traffic stop. "He became aggressive when I asked him to step out of the vehicle," Hayes explained, his voice firm. "I had no choice but to detain him." Marcus listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When it came time for cross-examination, he rose slowly, adjusting his tie before addressing the court. "Officer Hayes," Marcus began, his tone polite but piercing. "You mentioned that my client, myself, was aggressive. Can you describe what actions constituted aggression?" Hayes hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. He wouldn't comply immediately. He questioned my authority. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then flipped open his binder. "Isn't it true, Officer Hayes, that the law allows citizens to ask questions during a traffic stop, so long as they remain respectful and cooperative?" "Yes, but," Hayes started, only to be cut off by Marcus. "No further questions? At this moment, Your Honor," Marcus said smoothly, sitting back down. His point was clear. Hayes's interpretation of resistance seemed exaggerated at best. Next, Klein called another officer who had been present at the scene. This officer corroborated Hayes's account, though his details were noticeably vaguer. Marcus seized the opportunity, pressing the officer on specifics like timestamps and exact locations. With each question, cracks began to form in the prosecution's narrative. By the time Marcus finished, the jury looked visibly skeptical. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, Marcus's chance to present his defense. Standing before the judge and jury, he opened his binder and removed a stack of documents. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Marcus began, his voice steady and commanding. "What we have here is not a case of resisting arrest or assault. What we have is an example of selective enforcement and abuse of power." He went on to outline his argument, citing statutes and precedents that even Klein hadn't considered. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a missing dashcam video from Hayes's patrol car. Marcus pointed out that according to department policy, all traffic stops were required to be recorded. The absence of footage raised serious questions about whether Hayes had deliberately tampered with the evidence. As Marcus spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. People leaned forward in their seats, captivated by his eloquence and precision. Even Judge Thompson, who had initially seemed dismissive of Marcus's self-representation, now listened intently, nodding occasionally as Marcus dismantled the prosecution's case. When Marcus concluded his presentation, the room fell silent. Klein glanced nervously at Hayes, who sat stiffly in his chair, his confidence visibly shaken. For the first time, Hayes realized he might be in over his head. This wasn't just a routine trial. It was a battle of wits, and Marcus was proving to be a formidable opponent. During a brief recess, tension simmered outside the courtroom. Officers milled around, whispering among themselves, while reporters jotted down notes, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. In a corner near the water cooler, Hayes confronted Marcus, his face flushed with frustration. "You think you're smart, huh?" Hayes sneered, jabbing a finger toward Marcus. "This ain't over yet." Marcus met Hayes's glare with calm indifference. "It's not about being smart, Officer Hayes," he replied evenly. "It's about knowing the truth and exposing lies when they surface." His words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. For years, Hayes had operated under the assumption that his badge made him untouch any violated contemptible. Now, standing face to face with Marcus, he felt a chill run down his spine. This man wasn't just fighting for himself. He was challenging the very foundation of Hayes's authority. Back inside the courtroom, Marcus continued his relentless pursuit of justice. He introduced new evidence showing a disturbing pattern of misconduct by Hayes. Through painstaking research and countless hours poring over public records, Marcus uncovered several prior complaints filed against Hayes, including accusations of falsifying reports and coercing confessions. These allegations had never resulted in formal charges, largely because the victims lacked resources or feared retaliation. One particularly explosive revelation came when Marcus submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, unearthing documents that proved Hayes had been disciplined years earlier for planting evidence in a drug case. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Judge Thompson ordered a recess to review the documents. Outside, news of the discovery spread quickly, sparking outrage in the community. Hayes, desperate to salvage his reputation, tried to retaliate. He pressured witnesses to change their statements and attempted to fabricate new evidence linking Marcus to unrelated crimes. But Marcus anticipated these moves, filing motions to block Hayes's attempts and exposing his unethical behavior in open court. Each failed maneuver only deepened Hayes's humiliation. The turning point came when one of Hayes's former partners agreed to testify against him. Detective Rachel Monroe, a veteran officer with decades of experience, stepped forward after hearing about the case. "I've known Hayes for years," she admitted on the stand, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I've seen him bend the rules more times than I can count. This isn't the first time he's targeted someone unfairly." Monroe's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Jurors exchanged glances, their skepticism hardening into certainty. Even Klein, who had initially dismissed Marcus as an amateur, now found herself questioning the integrity of her own case. During a sidebar with Judge Thompson, she quietly expressed concerns about proceeding given the mounting evidence against Hayes. By the end of the day, it was clear that Marcus had turned the tables. What started as a routine traffic stop had morphed into a high-stakes showdown, exposing systemic flaws and holding those in power accountable. As Marcus packed up his notes and prepared to leave the courthouse, he paused briefly to address the crowd gathered outside. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying over the din. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Justice isn't blind, it's watching. And today we took a step toward making it fairer for everyone." With those words, Marcus walked away, leaving behind a stunned audience and a humbled Officer Hayes whose world was beginning to crumble around him. As the trial moved into its final stages, Marcus Johnson became more than just a defendant in a courtroom drama. He transformed into a symbol of resilience and hope for the people of Maplewood. News of his legal prowess spread far beyond the town limits, drawing attention from activists, journalists, and even lawyers who marveled at his ability to navigate complex legal waters without formal training. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Tattered Justice for Marcus" and "Legal Genius," turning his case into a rallying cry against systemic injustice. Inside the courtroom, Marcus continued to dismantle the prosecution's arguments with surgical precision. His closing statement was a masterclass in storytelling and logic. Standing before the jury, he painted a vivid picture of what had happened that night on the quiet road where Hayes pulled him over. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Marcus began, his voice steady but impassioned. "This isn't just about me. It's about fairness, it's about accountability. Officer Hayes didn't pull me over because I broke any laws. He did it because of who I am. And when I asked questions, when I exercised my rights, he saw that as a threat." He went on to explain how the lack of evidence supported his innocence. The missing dashcam footage, the inconsistencies in Hayes' testimony, and the pattern of misconduct all pointed to one conclusion: the charges against him were fabricated. "This isn't justice," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room. This is intimidation, but I refuse to be intimidated, and neither should you. The jury listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and disbelief. How could someone with no formal legal education outmaneuver seasoned professionals? Yet there was no denying the power of Marcus's words. Even Laura Klein, the prosecutor, seemed uneasy as she delivered her rebuttal, struggling to counter Marcus's irrefutable points. Outside the courthouse, the community rallied around Marcus. Young activists organized protests, holding signs that read "Truth over bias" and "Fairness for all." Local leaders spoke out, praising Marcus's courage and calling for reforms to address racial profiling and police misconduct. For many, Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for them, for every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color or socioeconomic status. Meanwhile, Officer Hayes grew increasingly desperate. Facing mounting scrutiny from internal affairs and the public eye, he lashed out, accusing Marcus of orchestrating a smear campaign against him. But his attempts to shift blame only made him look guiltier. In a last-ditch effort to save face, Hayes tried to discredit Marcus by suggesting he must have had help from professional lawyers. However, Marcus quickly shut down that argument by presenting receipts and notes proving he had done all the research himself. By the time closing arguments concluded, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Thompson reminded the jury of their duty to remain impartial and base their decision solely on the evidence presented. As the jurors filed out to deliberate, Marcus sat quietly, his expression unreadable. Friends and supporters whispered words of encouragement, but Marcus remained focused, knowing the fight wasn't over yet. The wait for the verdict felt endless. Hours ticked by as the jury deliberated behind closed doors, their discussions kept secret from the rest of the world. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras clicked incessantly, and spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus sat stoically, his hands clasped in front of him, while Officer Hayes paced nervously near the back of the room, occasionally glancing at the clock. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a decision. Everyone rose as Judge Thompson entered the room, his gavel in hand. The foreperson stood, clutching the verdict slip tightly, and read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Johnson, not guilty on all counts." A wave of cheers erupted in the courtroom, breaking the solemn silence. Supporters leapt to their feet, applauding and shouting words of celebration. Marcus remained seated, his face betraying little emotion, though a faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the moment without allowing himself to get swept up in the euphoria. For Officer Hayes, the verdict was devastating. His shoulders slumped, and he stared blankly at the floor, realizing the gravity of what had just happened. Not only had he lost the case, but his career and reputation were now hanging by a thread. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation into his conduct, uncovering years of unethical behavior that had gone unchecked. Within weeks, Hayes was stripped of his badge and terminated from the force. Federal investigators soon joined the probe, examining whether his actions constituted criminal violations. In the days following the trial, Marcus became a local hero. News outlets clamored for interviews, eager to hear his thoughts on the case and its broader implications. Instead of gloating or seeking revenge, Marcus used the platform to advocate for change. During a press conference outside the courthouse, he addressed the crowd, his voice calm but resolute. "This victory isn't mine alone," he said. "It belongs to everyone who has ever faced injustice and refused to stay silent. Today, we prove that knowledge is power. But let's not stop here. Let's work together to create a system that truly serves everyone." His words resonated deeply, inspiring countless others to take action. Community organizations sprang up, dedicated to educating people about their rights and advocating for police reform. Schools invited Marcus to speak to students, sharing his story as a testament to the importance of perseverance and education. Even some lawmakers took notice, introducing legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within law enforcement agencies. Despite the offers pouring, In from prestigious law firms wanting to hire him to universities inviting him to teach. Marcus chose to stay grounded. He returned to his job at the garage, finding comfort in the familiarity of fixing engines and chatting with customers. However, he also enrolled in night classes at a nearby university, pursuing a degree in law so he could continue fighting for justice in a more official capacity. As for Hayes, his fall from grace served as a cautionary tale. Once revered as a tough enforcer, he became a pariah, shunned by former colleagues and ridiculed by the community he once policed. Stripped of his authority and credibility, Hayes struggled to rebuild his life, haunted by the consequences of his actions. Years later, when asked about the trial, Marcus reflected on its lasting impact. "Justice isn't about revenge," he said during an interview. "It's about creating a world where everyone gets a fair shot. That's the lesson I hope people take away from my story." With those words, Marcus stepped into his future, ready to rewrite the rules of a game he had mastered through sheer determination and intellect. His journey wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. As the dust settled from the trial, Marcus Johnson found himself at a crossroads. The case that had once consumed his life was now behind him, but its impact lingered in profound ways. For Marcus, this wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of something bigger. He had proven himself not only as a legal genius but also as a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless against injustice. Now he faced a new challenge, deciding how to use his newfound platform to create lasting change. Marcus returned to his routine at the garage, fixing cars and chatting with customers as if nothing had changed. But things had changed, for him and for the community. Every day people stopped by, not just to get their vehicles repaired, but to thank Marcus for standing up against a system that often seemed unbeatable. Some shared stories of their own struggles with discrimination or unfair treatment, while others sought advice on how to navigate complicated legal situations. Marcus listened patiently, offering guidance whenever he could. He realized that his role extended far beyond being a mechanic. He had become a mentor, a source of inspiration and a voice for those without one. Despite the offers from high-profile law firms and universities, Marcus stayed rooted in Maplewood. He believed that real change happened at the grassroots level, where people lived and breathed the consequences of systemic inequities. Instead of chasing fame or fortune, he decided to focus on empowering others. He started hosting free workshops at the local library, teaching residents about their rights and how to advocate for themselves in court. These sessions quickly gained popularity, drawing crowds of all ages and backgrounds. Parents brought their children, hoping they'd learn valuable lessons about resilience and fairness. Young activists attended, eager to understand how they could amplify their voices in the fight for justice. Word of Marcus's efforts spread beyond Maplewood, attracting attention from national organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform. One such group offered to partner with him to create a program aimed at educating marginalized communities about the legal system. Together, they developed a curriculum that combined practical knowledge with real-world scenarios, equipping participants with tools to protect themselves from exploitation. The initiative was a resounding success, inspiring similar programs across the country. While Marcus focused on building a brighter future, Officer Daniel Hayes faced an entirely different reality. Stripped of his badge and ostracized by the community, Hayes struggled to rebuild his life. His attempts to find work were met with rejection after rejection, as employers hesitated to hire someone with his tarnished reputation. Friends and family distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with a man whose name had become synonymous with corruption. Hayes spent many sleepless nights replaying the trial in his mind, haunted by the realization that his actions had destroyed lives, including his own. Eventually, Hayes disappeared from public view altogether. Rumors circulated that he had moved out of state, seeking anonymity in a place where no one knew his name. While some felt sympathy for his plight, others saw it as poetic justice. To them, Hayes's downfall served as a reminder that power unchecked by morality inevitably leads to ruin. Back in Maplewood, Marcus continued to inspire through action. After completing his night classes, he passed the bar exam with flying colors, officially becoming a licensed attorney. Rather than joining a prestigious firm, he opened a small practice in the heart of town, specializing in civil rights cases. His office became a safe haven for individuals seeking justice, regardless of their ability to pay. Marcus worked tirelessly, taking on cases that others deemed too difficult or unwinnable. Each victory reinforced his belief that the law could be a force for good when wielded with integrity. Over time, Marcus's story took on a life of its own. It was featured in documentaries, books, and even a movie that highlighted his courage and determination. Yet despite the accolades, Marcus remained humble. When asked about his legacy during an interview, he smiled softly and said, "I don't want to be remembered as someone who beat the system. I want to be remembered as someone who helped others believe they could do the same." Years later, Marcus stood outside the courthouse where his trial had taken place. The building looked the same, but the world around it had transformed. The town of Maplewood was no longer defined by division and fear. Instead, it thrived as a model of unity and progress. Activists carried forward the work Marcus had started, ensuring that his vision of fairness endured long after he was gone. As he gazed at the courthouse steps, Marcus thought back to the young man he had been, a quiet mechanic with big dreams and an unshakable faith in the power of knowledge. He had come so far, yet he knew there was still much work to be done. With a deep breath, he turned away from the courthouse and walked toward his car, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For Marcus Johnson, the fight for justice was never truly over. It was a lifelong mission, one fueled not by anger or revenge, but by the unwavering belief that everyone deserved a fair shot. And in that belief, he found purpose, strength, and the courage to keep moving forward.